Welcome to today's session. We are excited to have our final episode in this season's Usable Knowledge Live Literacy Insights series. I'm Phil Capin, an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Over the course of this series, we've tried to connect evidence from reading science with the day-to-day challenges and successes that teachers are facing in schools. And we talked a lot about many important topics related to reading. And this session, I think, is unique in that we're bringing in an educator. Who better to talk about education than an educator? Um, and so today we're going to do that. And we're going to close out the series by thinking about what has this year in literacy revealed? What have we, unearthed in our series? And what do we really want to carry forward with us in the next year? So as we're getting settled, we encourage you to add to the chat. You can share your name, location, and role, and maybe one thing you're reflecting on as the school year comes to a close. As you're doing that, I'll introduce our guest. Really honored and fortunate to be joined by Margaret Goldberg. Margaret is the co-founder of the Right to Read Project, an organization that's focused on bringing together educators, researchers, and advocates to advance equity through literacy. She's also a reading coach in the West Contra Costa Unified School District in California, and really a leading voice in our country in helping schools translate reading research into practice. Margaret, thank you for being here.
I'm so glad to be with you during summer vacation.
Yes, it's the last week of school in Massachusetts, so my two daughters are really excited for Friday. So as you're wrapping up the school year and looking back on this year in literacy, what both at your school and in the field more broadly, what stands out to you about this year?
This year was a shift in approach for me. So I've been at my school for the past 5 years, and I came into coaching there with an idea of what was going to happen. I almost had like a scope and sequence for how I was going to approach my time there. Like, I'm going to focus on getting foundational skills instruction right, and then we're going to focus on language, and we're going to focus on writing, and then we'll focus on comprehension. And actually, it turns out things don't work that way. You can't just shift your focus from one project to the next because you have to keep maintaining all of the things that you started. It's more like juggling, like you start one thing and you have to put some work into keeping that ball up in the air instead of just shifting your focus to the next topic. So this year I really focused on implementation science and what I could learn about how to keep initiatives going, how to maintain full implementation, and then how to get other things going in a way that's more headed towards sustainability instead of what we typically do in education, which is like start one thing and then shift to the next initiative and the previous one falls apart.
Yeah. So what are the initiatives that you were really focused on sustaining this year, and what were some of the newer initiatives that you took on?
So my school, starting from my beginning of my time there, had focused on what we call walk to read. So that's a period of time where we share students across classrooms. So first and second grade teachers team up and share students. Third and fourth grade teachers team up and share students. And it's a chunk of time that's devoted to intervention and acceleration, and for kids who need it, grade level content, in addition to what they receive in English and language arts in their homeroom classes. And it's actually a really fun project that takes a whole lot of work. There's a lot of data analysis, there's a lot of teacher collaboration, there's a lot of trying to figure out what the next stage of instruction should look like. When I first started there, we were just implementing an evidence based foundational skills program. Our goal was fidelity to that program. And then as we've been doing it for more years, the focus really has been like, now that we know how to do this kind of instruction, what do we do with the kids who have graduated? They've got their phonics master, but they're still not applying it to
Mm.
text in the way that we want them to. Or what do we do for students who are reading in a way that might sound fluent, but they don't have the language comprehension to really benefit from the text that we're giving them in the way that we want? So that's been one initiative that's been focused on
Mm.
data and instruction and differentiation. We've also been focusing with homeroom instruction on language comprehension and on writing.
Yeah. Great. So It sounds like the foundational skills instruction is you feel like in maybe a stronger place, and that's what you were thinking about sustaining during this, what I think other schools might refer to as like an intervention or an intervention plus enrichment block. Um, yeah, so tell me more about the focus on oral language and language comprehension and writing, both in maybe the core instruction and in this intervention block.
Yeah, so focusing on the language part first, I realized a little while ago, a couple years ago, that I had this misconception about language. I was like, it develops naturally.
Mm,
That means we don't really need to teach it that much.
hmm.
Like if we teach the kids to read the words, then they will just know the meanings of those words and everything's going to be fine in grade three and up. And I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, we really should have known. There's lots of evidence that that's not the case. But actually, a lot of curriculum approach it that way of like just exposure being the goal, not necessarily having a scope and sequence for vocabulary, not having clear instructional routines for academic discussion. Like, I think it's a pretty common misconception.
Hmm.
And so I've been lucky enough to be able to partner with a speech and language pathologist, Tiffany Hogan, and she has been helping us implement researcher designed language comprehension lessons. And it was mind blowing. I was like, you can do explicit instruction for language and you can intensify that instruction in tier two and in tier three, like just the way that we think about foundational skills. There are things about it that are different because the way language develops is different than what we're aiming for with foundational skills. But it was very cool to be able to see that the like I do, we do, and you do, you do kind of approach to lesson planning really works on the language side of things too.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. I think a lot of what we've thought about as the science of reading has been thought about and focused in word recognition. And we know that the other side of the simple view of reading, word recognition times, right, multiplied by language comprehension, the outcome of that is reading comprehension. And there hasn't been as much attention on language comprehension. It's not to say researchers and teachers don't know it's critical, but I think we haven't had quite as much science there and as much attention in our curriculum. I think we've been really thoughtful in some ways about how to specifically teach all the, code-based skills and haven't had that same precision with language comprehension. And when we're talking about language comprehension, we're thinking not just of vocabulary, and I know you're not just thinking about that. You're thinking of vocabulary, which is critical. Can't understand a text if you don't know what the words mean, but also the syntax of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
How sentences are made. And when you're reading a passage, even, a third or fourth grade passage, there's going to be a lot of syntax that's difficult for children to parse. And so it's really helpful to teach them, connectives. Like, when you have, however, that is connecting these two ideas and contrasting them, right? And then there's also discourse level patterns, right? And so there's like narrative texts have their own structure. Well, multiple structures, but often they have a structure around these story elements. And then there's informational passages. And so it sounds like that's the sort of focus that you've had over the last year is really trying to ramp up that instruction, the oral language instruction. And then you also talked about writing, and those two things really
Yeah,
powerful when connected.
definitely. And I think the writing portion of things has been interesting for me. So we have been focusing on an approach called self-regulated strategy development, SRSD. And what I really appreciated about it was that no one had taught me how to teach writing systematically. I had never been
Hmm.
really given a roadmap for how to be explicit in writing instruction. And SRSD also has this gradual release of responsibility, but it approaches it differently. It's not within a single lesson that you model something and then the kids do it with you and then they do it on their own. It actually extends through weeks of like, what does it look like to build background knowledge about that genre? What does it look like to teach kids what high quality exemplars look like, the language that they
Hmm.
need in order to be able to write in that genre, and then getting them set up through collaboratively writing eventually to be able to do their own writing. And I think one of the things that's been most fun about that is that you can see their language development in the writing. Like sometimes it's hard to be able to realize how much kids are learning from the academic discussion they're having
Hmm.
during language comprehension lessons. But then when we see those explicitly taught vocabulary words showing up in their writing, it feels like we've won.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, there's been this expression, every teacher a reading teacher. And, I think, I'm writing this article right now, and in the article I'm making the case that every teacher a language teacher and every a writing teacher, because I think underestimated the role of language and of writing to support reading. I mean, our for writing, when we write things, it really consolidates our thinking. And when you start to read like a writer, it improves your reading. And so we see these really nice reciprocal effects, I think, between reading and writing. And the same is true for language. I mean, if you don't understand something in oral conversation, it's unlikely you're then going to understand it on when written down, right? And so giving students more opportunities to have classroom discussion. And it's not to say that, checking for understanding and asking questions, comprehension questions that we often see in classrooms is not valuable. But I also think we need to take a further step to make sure that students are engaged in conversations about text. Because oftentimes, I don't know if this is the case at the campuses you're visiting, Margaret, but oftentimes what I see in classrooms is that teachers, really well-intentioned teachers, really smart teachers, are doing a lot of the work, especially in the discourse. They're doing a lot of the talking, a lot of the thinking. And so I think in addition to pushing on oral language and writing, thinking about this classroom discourse. What have you seen related to
Yeah, one of the things that has come up a fair amount is Tiffany, our research pal, has talked about like, you want a noisy classroom. And I think that that's something that we're a little bit afraid of. Like
that? Hmm.
we're outnumbered, right? There's one of us and like 25 kids, right? And we're very aware that there's a tenuous power dynamic that is there when you are one teacher alone in the classroom. But you do actually need to have so much more in the way of student to student interactions. You do need to set up protocols where they're talking on topic so that everybody's getting that opportunity to practice. Because otherwise, it's the teacher getting the practice of reading or thinking or developing their own oral language instead of I think shifting our expectation of what an effective classroom looks like during language instruction. It's a little bit messier, I think, than what we've been trained to look for.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I guess the one thing I would add is that you could have classroom talk and it can still be really structured. And the interventions that I've worked on and the programs that I've helped develop and professional learning that we've offered, it's not to say that you as the teacher are not, really facilitating the learning. You are. And you can have, clear expectations for what students are doing, but students benefit from that. They benefit from the structure. Um, but you're right. You do have to hand over responsibility and engage students in the conversation. And I think a couple things to do is to have, clear roles, to provide language scaffolds so that students have, perhaps a sentence stem to get started. But then, what I really like, and I don't know if you've read Trisha Zucker and Sonia Cabell have a book, Strive for Five, which is
Mm-hmm.
incorporating, more discourse in the classroom. And they wrote it, primarily for K-3 or pre-K-3. But if you read it, it applies to every classroom.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need more turns. And so if you provide the initial sentence stem so that students will respond to their partner, for instance, in a partner activity, that's helpful. But I think also you need to give them some support in how do they build on their partner's response. So I agree with, this, or you know what, I'm not sure I agree with that because the text says this. So if you can get them to have these multi-turn opportunities, I think it's really helpful to learning. So I'm so
Yeah.
glad
And I
you're
think,
focused on that.
yeah. So I would just add on everything that we've said has been about kids talking, which is super important. But there's the other side of language instruction that we need to teach, which is listening. And then, like, what does it look like to be an attentive listener? Because you can't say, oh, I disagree with you, or I want to add on if you weren't actually listening to what your partner was saying. So I think one of the things that's been a little bit challenging to figure out how to teach is how to get kids to be fully engaged in a discussion that involves listening attentively, not just thinking about what you want to share next, but being able to wrestle with the ideas that go in a back and forth conversation. And honestly, in life, we're not getting enough practice doing that, like
Mm,
just
yeah.
generally.
Yeah. I think this, hits on two themes that came up across our literacy series. One was that, explicit instruction, so having a clear learning goal, modeling it, giving students opportunities to practice is really important. We also had an episode with Claude Goldenberg and Paolo Uccelli, where they really talked about how this can be helpful for multilingual learners and for all students. And I know you serve, diverse students at your campus and are focused on that. And so I do think, listening and speaking and having this explicit instruction can be very helpful. And I think for the listening piece, giving students opportunities to respond and maintain engagement is really
Mhm.
critical. So as we're thinking about evidence-based instruction, we're talking about, some of the ways in which at your campus and at other campuses you've helped to make sure that practices that are found to be evidence-based are finding their way into classrooms. But we know implementation can be really messy. Contexts differ. There's policies that can roll out unevenly, and teachers are already asked to do so much. So from your vantage point, how can we best, bridge what we know from research and practice in ways that respect and honor teachers and also students and the variability among them?
Um, well, I think you and I were talking a little bit before we officially got started about how I've come to realize that different researchers offer different forms of support. So some focus on furthering research, so research for research's sake. Some focus on developing particular instructional practices or curriculum or intervention, and they do that in partnership with teachers. But that work is typically grant funded, so it's short term and it like results in a product. And I think some researchers who have done that have realized like we do that. And then when we leave the school, when the grant funding ends, like
Mm.
the initiative just stops. Like I thought that they were going to continue doing it and then they didn't. And so some researchers have gotten really curious about what it looks like to engage in what are called research to practice partnerships. So this ongoing collaboration. And that's what I care the most about because I'm a practitioner in a school. And what I really appreciate about that kind of research is that it's focused on the messiness of the real world and trying to understand how do you get good practice to spread and to stick despite all of these conflicting initiatives that might get going or like something else will come in and so focus shifts. And I feel like what I've been learning about it is that we need to get more honest about how hard it is. And I think part of it is that it can be frustrating to researchers to maybe see that there are so many things that are competing for a teacher's attention. But I think actually, when we speak up about like classroom management has to be part of the discussion of evidence based practices. If we're being told that we need to do small group instruction, there has to be a plan for what the other kids in the room are doing.
Mm.
Like we have to kind of set things up so that the translation is easier. And is done in partnership instead of teachers just trying to make the best of something that was never really designed for them and their circumstances.
Yeah. I think you brought up two really important ideas. One is this implementation science, right? Which is really studying the best way to make sure that evidence-based practices are adopted and sustained. And I think there's lots of people that this is a sort of an emerging field, and there's lots of people that I think are beginning to focus on this, and I think we need much more study of it. I think we both agree that understanding the best ways to teach reading or writing and to integrate oral language, I think is valuable. And, the thing about science is that it's never settled, right? And so we can advance our knowledge, but we need just as much attention to implementation science, probably, especially in those areas that we know a lot about, like, early reading. I think we know a lot about, how to provide code-based instruction. And that's not to say we figured out the implementation challenges. And so, what's it like when you think about implementation science and how maybe it's helped your school? For those that are out there, what are the ways that you find it productive maybe to work with researchers, and or what are the big lessons that you've learned from those partnerships?
Well, I'll just start with a little bit of a story, which is that we were focused with Tiffany on implementing language instruction that was evidence based. And I gave her a call at the last summer, and I was like, I'm so sorry. We really care very much about this work. I promise you, I care, but we're not going to actually really be able to do much with it in this next school year because we're getting a new math curriculum. And I
Mm.
felt really bad about that. And she was like, don't worry about it. like I study implementation science, and what this is called is competing initiatives and competing priorities. There's a research base about competing priorities. Let me look up the evidence-based strategies so that I can help you guys know how to balance having multiple initiatives going on at the same time. And I just felt this pressure, just like, whoosh, okay, like we're just gonna like approach this in a methodical way instead of just feeling frazzled and overburdened and torn in too many different directions. We're going to try to, I call it like, be metacognitive about the
Mm,
process of implementation. And so she gave us really great guidance about how to be aware of what stage of implementation we're in for each one of our initiatives, how to know what you need to accomplish in that stage, how to know what's necessary in order to be able to further your implementation, and how to have realistic expectations about how long it takes to get it done well. Like, I think I have this sense of urgency. Like, I want to learn how to do
mm.
the thing and like get it right that year and then replicate it the next year. And we really need to look at a like 3 to 7 year span, which a lot of educators don't have the time or patience or like the conditions to be able to think in that kind of a timeline. But it's what we realistically need to do in order to improve reading outcomes for kids.
Yeah. So I think maybe the big idea here is that I think when teachers think about, and when I was a teacher, this is what I thought about. When I thought about research, I was thinking about the best ways to teach. But there's so much else to research. There's, how do you balance competing priorities being one example? How do you develop school systems in such a way that they can serve all students well? Let's say you have limited resources around high dosage tutoring, like you have a set budget. How do you allocate those resources? These are all questions that maybe research could inform, especially when research is focused on implementation science. So when you're
Agreed.
thinking about next year and the priorities that you want to put forth, and it sounds like it's not just new initiatives, it's going to be sustaining initiatives. What are the commitments or priorities that you're going to carry forward with you next year?
So we actually did a whole lot of work with our instructional leadership team, which we have reworked to be an implementation team. So our instructional leadership
Mm,
team focuses explicitly on implementation. And it took us, I want to say it was like a month, maybe it was a month and a half of meeting every other week to be able to define what we are trying to accomplish next year and to write goals so that we can be very transparent about what success is going to look like. So since we've got a lot going on, we did it for every subject area. So we worked on drafting goals that are for any teachers who are new to our school or in the early ages of learning how to do something, or like maybe they just had a baby and they need to like just focus on like the basic goal, like what is that going to be, and what is a goal that's going to be appropriate for teachers who are like, I'm ready, like let's go, I've got that down, we're going to deepen practice. So like an example of that is I had mentioned SRSD. So we have a
mm,
goal where teachers are going to deliver SRSD writing instruction 4 times a week. We're going to complete all 3 genres: persuasive, informational, and narrative, before April, because I mean, that's when state testing happens. So that's why we had to set that part. And that we're going to reflect on our implementation using, we have these like kind of fidelity checks that are mostly for reflection on, are we doing everything that's needed in this particular stage of SRSD writing instruction so that we can adjust instruction like we need. So that's like a teacher facing goal. And we want to be very transparent that we're all working on that in our classrooms. And then we also worked on developing collaboration goals because our teachers meet after school on Wednesdays to be able to get better at the teaching that we're trying to do. So, like for writing, we want to set aside time for teams to analyze student writing, to talk about what challenges are coming up, and figure out how to tweak instruction in order to meet the needs of our students. And then it's not fair to be like, here are the expectations of teachers to do. We actually need to be really clear about like, how does our principal support? How do I, as a
mm.
coach, support? So teachers on our instructional leadership team wrote our leadership goals. So, for example, for writing, one of the goals is that I need to make sure to facilitate 3 student work analysis meetings per year, one per genre, that's going to help the teams to be able to look at student writing above and below their grade level so that we're working on cohesiveness. And I'm actually really excited about this because I think a lot of times schools lack accountability across roles. Like teachers being accountable to
Mm,
grade level teams, being accountable to leadership, but also it needs to go the other way. Like leadership needs to be directly supporting the work of teams and directly supporting the work that's happening in the classroom so that we're all helping each other go forward.
yeah. For those in the audience who may not be as familiar with SRSD, it's self-regulated strategy development. It was developed, I think you said, by Karen Harris.
And Steve Graham,
And
yeah.
Steve Graham, and it's the approach to providing writing instruction that has the largest evidence base. And so it's been shown to be effective. It's really explicit, so it sort of ties into what we know is helpful for novice learners across word reading, across reading comprehension, and now writing. I'm excited about that. I think, when I think about the things that I hope our field will focus on over the next year, I do think that, focusing on language is really helpful as a mechanism for improving reading. I think of focusing on writing as a mechanism for improving reading and writing, which is an important outcome. Um, and then I really like your ideas about instructional coaching. As you know, I was an instructional coach once, and I
Mm.
really enjoyed instructional coaching. And I do think that when done well, when instructional coaches are alongside teachers and accountable, as you suggest, it can really lead to positive impacts. Um, I wanted to ask you, our series is coming to an end, and I hope folks on the webinar will watch our prior episodes and find them helpful. But what sources of information do you rely on, in addition to maybe this series, to sort of understand what works in education and in reading?
That's a really big question. So it's hard because there's actually a great problem that I had wished for, which is like teachers are inundated with
Mm,
information now that is calling itself the science of reading. There was a time when I first started getting into this in like 2015, 2016, where I was like, we need teacher to teacher stuff that just doesn't exist. Now it does. So you can be in a Facebook group or, there's teacher TikTok or wherever. There's all sorts of sources of information. And a lot of it claims to be evidence based. And I think there's a few things that I do that help me figure out if that source is reliable. So one is like actually looking to see the who is providing this study that just came into my inbox. There's a lot of glossy publications that look like they're research, but they're actually produced by people who are selling a product. So being able to weed those out. Finding the things that are not for profit has been really helpful for
mm,
me. So like kind of early on, I discovered like, oh, this stuff on reading rockets is pretty good. I had no idea that it was like connected to Louisa Motz's teaching reading as rocket science. I didn't understand that that was part of the founding of Reading Rockets. There's Reading Universe now, which is done by many of the same people. They're trying to make the content organized according to a taxonomy, so it'd be easier to find what you're looking for there. I also, where else do I look? So where do I look? Um,
I guess I could add one to the conversation, and that's the Department of Education. Has the
the
Institute of
practice
Education
guides.
Science. Yeah. And within those, they have the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides, which, there's different versions of them. I think some of them are quite long. But I would say that they're excellent sources of information. So what you have is you have a panel, you know this, Margaret, but maybe not everyone in the
Mm.
audience will. There's a panel of researchers and practitioners that come together to evaluate evidence in an area, for instance, K3 reading or writing, and they make recommendations. And what I like about the recommendations is there's lots of graphics and practical tips that can be helpful. So I'll just put in the chat a link to some of the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides that are offered there. I really think, I'm not affiliated with that, nor am I affiliated with Reading Universe, but I would say that the Reading Universe website offers many good resources. And I guess I'm not clear on how they're different from Reading Rockets, but I find both of those websites to have reliable information, both credible and trustworthy. Um, and I guess I would also add that for those that are, on the webinar today or watch it later or teachers more generally that if you email researchers, many of us, will respond and share what my 2 cents might be about whether some source is credible or and I do think that there's lots of researchers that are really eager to provide support to educators.
Yeah, and I feel like so I didn't know that that was really the case. Someone had told me that. Like if you email a researcher because their paper's behind a paywall, they will try to get it to you and try to help you. And that's actually true. Like I think it's happened at least 75% of the time if I ask. And it actually sometimes turns into these email relationships where you can say like, "Oh, I was reading this and I have a question about it." Like, and people will actually want to try to have that kind of discussion. Another more teacher focused place to look would be the Goyen Fellowships. The Goyen Foundation has Teachers Teaching Teachers, which is a
Mm,
series. I think they have a webinar that's coming up next week. And I think part of that, what I like is that it's teachers trying to make sense of the research and being very transparent as their understanding is changing. Like I used to think this, but now I'm understanding this, and this is what I'm trying in my classroom. And it's a different way of approaching teaching when you're trying to like keep up with refining practice instead of the like, oh, I, just teach my curriculum or like I've got it down, I don't need to change. It's a group of people who are all trying to get better together.
yeah. No, I think that's a really powerful initiative. And this idea that teachers teaching teachers is probably, more productive than oftentimes researchers trying to support teachers. Because I don't think we always know the day-to-day challenges and insights that are necessary to really translate some of what we know from more controlled settings to other settings. Um, the We're coming to a close here, and so I just want to say thank you so much, Margaret, both for your work and for the you have a lot of knowledge about research, but you also have this practical wisdom that you shared with the audience today. So I really appreciate it, Margaret.
I was so glad to be with you.
And I want to thank everyone who joined, both live or for our recording. We will send out an email with links to the video and a brief summary of the key takeaways and additional resources. As we close the Literacy Insight series, I just want to say how thankful I am to everyone who contributed to the series and to everyone in the audience who's doing the really important work of teaching, coaching, leading in schools. Hopefully, I hope you'll stay connected through the Usable Knowledge live series. I imagine we'll have another series next year. And there's also lots of articles on the Hugsy website that might be beneficial. Until then, thank you all.